Okay, so you really want to dive deep on Barack Obama.
We're going deep beyond the surface.
Not just like the name recognition, right? Like the actual story.
Yeah, the real deal. The influences, the highs and lows, all of it.
Exactly. And you want it like interesting, not just a boring history lesson.
We're going for insightful, not just reciting dates and facts.
Exactly. And that's what we're all about.
You came to the right place. It's a journey, this guy's life. You can't really separate Obama from, like, recent American history, you know?
It's all intertwined.
Race, politics on a global scale, it's all connected to his story.
Yeah, and speaking of his story, can we just talk about his childhood for a second?
Yeah.
I mean, born in Hawaii, then he's living in Indonesia for a while, then back to Hawaii.
Talk about a mix of influences.
It's a lot. Like, I get stressed moving between time zones, let alone completely different cultures and continents.
It wasn't your typical upbringing, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And you can see how those experiences, those early exposures to different cultures really shaped his worldview, you know?
Oh, totally.
You see it later in how he approached foreign policy, social justice, even just his own identity.
It's fascinating. And then you layer on top of that, right, the academic success.
Right.
This is a guy who went to Punahou School, then Columbia, then Harvard Law. I mean, come on.
We're talking top-tier institutions.
Exactly. So with a resume like that, what's the obvious next step? Community organizer in Chicago.
Not exactly the typical path.
Right. You'd think corporate law, big money, something like that. But instead, he's like, I'm going to work at the grassroots level. What's that about?
It's a fascinating choice, and I think it really speaks to this deep commitment to social change.
Okay.
This wasn't theoretical for him. You know, he was in the streets of Chicago, seeing the effects of inequality firsthand, working to make a tangible difference in people's lives. And that kind of experience, that's what shapes a leader.
That's the real deal right there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this guy who's not afraid to roll up his sleeves, right? He's been in the trenches. And then 2008 hits.
Big time.
Yes, we can.
Electrifying.
It was more than a campaign slogan. It was this feeling, this energy. I mean, even watching it on TV, you could feel it, right?
It was a moment.
Yeah.
It tapped into something very real, a desire for change, for unity, for progress. And let's be real, the historical weight of that election, electing the first black president.
Huge.
It was seismic. It was symbolic of so much. And it held this promise of, like, reshaping America's relationship with race.
It's hard to overstate that, honestly. Okay, so he takes office, right? Expectations are through the roof.
Sky high.
So what did he actually get done? What are we talking about when we talk about the Obama presidency?
Well, you can't talk about Obama without talking about the Affordable Care Act, right? Like, it or hate it, it was massive.
It was a whole thing.
Millions of people got health insurance who didn't have it before. And it really ignited this debate about the role of government in healthcare.
A debate that's still going on today.
Absolutely.
It's interesting, though, right? Because the sources talk about that, the Affordable Care Act, right alongside his handling of the 2008 financial crisis.
Right. And those seem like such different beasts to tackle.
Completely different.
Right. One's this, like, long-term structural issue, and the other one is like, the economy's on fire, what do we do right now?
In the moment, yeah.
Yeah.
It's true. And yet, both of them required this, like, steady hand. He had to make tough calls and project calm under pressure. I mean, remember, he inherited an economy in free fall.
Yeah, it was a mess.
The worst downturn since the Depression?
And he could have easily gotten bogged down in the blame game,
Oh, for sure.
pointing fingers, which I feel like happens a lot in politics.
Oh, yeah.
But he was very much like, no, we need solutions.
Exactly. Focused on solutions, worked with both sides of the aisle, had to stabilize the financial system.
It was a lot.
It was. And then you layer on top of that the whole foreign policy landscape.
Right. Because it's not like things are calm over there either.
Right. And that's a whole other beast.
A whole other can of worms.
Exactly.
And the sources mention some of his key moves, right? Like his approach to Cuba, to Iran. Big ones, yeah.
And it seems like those weren't just about reacting to whatever crisis was happening at the moment, you know. It was about fundamentally trying to change the game.
It was. With Cuba, he starts to thaw relations after, like, decades of Cold War animosity.
It's a long time.
Right. That image of him, and it really is an image that sticks with you, in Havana, meeting with Raul Castro.
Iconic.
It was a deliberate signal, you know, turning the page on a very complicated history. And then you've got the Iran nuclear deal.
Ooh, that was a big one.
Extremely controversial.
Mm-hmm.
But at its core, it was about choosing diplomacy, recognizing that sometimes you have to negotiate with people you don't agree with to prevent something worse. These weren't just policies, these were strategic bets. a long view of America's role in the world.
And it's funny how those two examples, right, Cuba and Iran, they highlight just how messy foreign policy is.
Oh, yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have this historic opening with Cuba. Seems like everyone's generally on board with that. And then you have the Iran deal, which, people within his own party were against it. So clearly, no easy answers.
No easy
This
answers.
is
It's so complex, right? It's not just about, like, what's the right answer. You're weighing priorities, managing risk, thinking about the long game, the consequences.
And speaking of high stakes, we got to talk about some of the tougher aspects of his foreign policy.
Yeah.
The sources mention Libya, for example.
Right.
The use of drone strikes that really ramped up during his presidency.
It did.
It's like we went from yes, we can to, oof, this is complicated.
That's leadership for you.
Yeah.
You're dealing with these messy situations where there's no perfect solution.
And no easy answers.
Libya is a perfect example. The goal, at the start anyway, was to prevent a humanitarian crisis.
Right.
Stop Gaddafi's crackdown.
Right.
But even with good intentions, you have these ripple effects, these unintended consequences.
And backfired.
You could say that. It
Yeah.
created a power vacuum, more instability, more violence. It's what happens when you intervene in these complex civil conflicts.
Even with the best of intentions, it can go sideways.
Exactly. And then you have drone strikes,
Okay.
already controversial under Bush.
Right.
But Obama, he really escalated their use.
He did.
Now, their argument was it's more precise, less collateral damage than a full-on military operation.
Okay.
But critics, they argued it sets a dangerous precedent, right? Extrajudicial killings, lack of accountability.
It's a slippery slope.
For sure. And then there's the moral aspect, the ethical questions, the impact on civilians, on the drone operators themselves. It's a lot to unpack.
Heavy stuff. A lot to think about. Okay, let's shift gears back to domestic policy for a bit.
Sure.
Because even with the Affordable Care Act, the economic recovery, he still faced some serious pushback here at home.
Oh, absolutely.
So what were some of the biggest obstacles he faced? What got in the way of enacting his agenda?
I think, honestly, it was the political climate at the time.
Yeah.
Things were so polarized. The Tea Party movement was gaining traction.
Right.
Republicans took control of Congress during his second term. It was like gridlock city up in there.
It was.
Compromise became a bad word. You couldn't get anything done.
Yeah.
Even the uncontroversial stuff was a battle.
The sources really highlight that just this constant gridlock partisan fighting.
It makes you wonder, how does anything get done?
Right.
Like ever.
Seriously.
It's definitely a challenge. I mean, he came in with this message of unity, of hope,
Right.
but the reality of governing in that kind of environment, much more complicated.
It's one thing to campaign on it,
Totally.
but then actually having to work with people who disagree with you?
And sometimes flat out oppose everything you stand for.
It's gotta be tough.
It is.
Yeah.
Even when he had a Democratic majority, like his first term, passing the Affordable Care Act, it was brutal. Countless hours of negotiating, compromising, just trying to get enough votes to get it over the finish line.
Wow.
And even then, there were things he couldn't get done.
Like what?
Closing Guantanamo, for example.
Yeah.
He campaigned on that.
He did.
But the political obstacles, the logistics, it just never happened.
It's almost like a lesson in presidential limitations.
It is. You can have the biggest platform in the world,
Right. Everyone's listening.
but if Congress won't play ball, your hands are tied.
You're stuck.
Exactly. It shows that the presidency, it's not all powerful.
Right.
It's one branch, one part of a bigger system.
Checks and balances and all that.
Exactly. And Obama understood that, of course, but there's a difference between understanding it intellectually
Right.
and then living it every day with all the frustrations and limitations.
It gives you a new perspective, right? When you're evaluating a president, any president,
Absolutely.
it's not just about the individual policies.
It's bigger than that.
It's about the context, what they were up against.
Exactly. You can't separate their actions from the historical moment.
The forces at play.
Right. What were the challenges the country was facing? What opportunities were available to them? What constraints were they working with?
It's like you can't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree.
Right. It's about the environment they were swimming in. You got it. And it makes you think about, like, presidential influence after they leave office. It doesn't just disappear, does it?
It's so true. Especially these days, right? Everyone's got a platform, a way to reach people.
Exactly.
So what about Obama? He's been pretty active since leaving the White House.
Oh, yeah, he hit the ground running. He and Michelle started the Obama Foundation, right?
Right.
Focusing on leadership development, civic engagement. which really tracks with his whole thing about grassroots change.
Empowering people.
Exactly.
And of course, he wrote his memoir.
The Promised Land.
Yeah, which gave us this really interesting look behind the curtain.
For sure.
His thoughts, his challenges, what it was actually like in those rooms.
Definitely. And he didn't just stop there.
Right. Because he's still out there talking about the big issues.
He is. Social justice, climate change, even the state of democracy itself.
It's like he's found a way to use that platform he built for good, even outside of elected office. It makes you think about legacy, right? What's the lasting impact of the Obama presidency? How will history remember him?
That's the million-dollar question. It's tempting to focus on specific policies,
Sure.
like the Affordable Care Act or the Iran deal. But honestly, I think it's bigger than that. It's about what he represented, the possibilities he opened up.
How so?
He showed the world, really showed them, that a black man could be president of the United States. And not just once, twice.
And not just be president, but do it with, everyone agrees, a sense of grace and intelligence.
Exactly. He held on to his values.
Right.
He wasn't afraid to be himself.
And let's not forget, he did it while facing some pretty fierce opposition.
Oh, for sure. Constant political battles.
Right. It was a crazy time.
It was. And that's part of his legacy too, don't you think? He showed that you can disagree, even strongly disagree, and still be decent.
Have a civil conversation.
Exactly. Opponents, not enemies.
It's something we could all use a little more of these days.
Big time. And whether you agreed with his policies or not, you got to admit, he brought a certain something back to the presidency.
Dignity.
Yeah.
Thoughtfulness. He actually thought about things before he spoke,
It's funny because when you really think about his story, it touches on everything we've been talking about.
It does.
Race, leadership, the ups and downs of trying to create change. It's almost like a microcosm of America itself.
They're perfectly said. And that's what makes a deep dive like this so fascinating, right? We're going beyond the headlines, beyond the surface level, trying to really understand the nuances.
And like any good deep dive, we're left with even more questions.
Right. More to think about, more to explore.
Exactly. It's all about sparking that curiosity, getting people to dig deeper on their own.
Love it.
So to everyone listening, keep that curiosity alive. Keep asking questions. Keep exploring.
Yes.
And hey, if you're ever looking for a place to start, you know where to find us.
That's right. Until next time, happy deep diving, everybody.